You wake to the chill of stone beneath your bare feet, the kind of cold that seeps into the bones. The torchlight flickers, casting long shadows across the chamber walls, where tapestries hang heavy with dust and the faint scent of damp wool. Your heart hammers like a blacksmith's forge, each beat echoing in the silence, broken only by the wind's howl through narrow arrow slits. At 12 years old, still slender as a reed, you stand in a gown of stiff brocade that scratches against your skin, embroidered with threads that gleam like captured moonlight but weigh you down like chains. The door creaks open. In steps a man twice your age, his breath sour with wine from the feast below, his eyes shadowed by the expectations of kingdoms. This is no dream of love. This is your wedding night, and the fear coils in your gut like a serpent. Tonight, your innocence becomes a seal on alliances forged in ink and blood. Your body a vessel for heirs not yet born. To fail is to invite disgrace, or worse, death in the agony of childbed, a fate that claimed countless women long before their hair turned gray. It is in these forgotten chambers, half buried in dust and memory, that some of Europe's greatest dynasties were forged, not by kings in armor, but by the trembling bodies of young girls forced into womanhood overnight. One of those girls was named Matilda. Born around 1102 in England's royal court, she was the daughter of King Henry I, a man whose dominion stretched from Normandy's misty shores to the rugged hills of Wales. From the moment she could toddle, she was less a daughter than a bargaining chip. Her father's gaze upon her was not tender but calculating, a ruler's mind already weighing her worth in political alliances. By 1109, when she was only 7 years old, emissaries of the Holy Roman Empire crossed the Channel. They bore the proposals of Emperor Henry V, a man in his 20s hardened by campaigns against restless dukes, a man whose eyes were fixed on the survival of his vast realm. For him, Matilda was not a child but a link in the chain of European power. The betrothal was sealed in Utrecht on April 10, 1110. Matilda, still more child than woman, was dispatched across the sea to Germany. Imagine her crossing, the waves battering the ship, the cold spray stinging her face, the coastline of England shrinking into a gray blur. Ahead lay dense German forests and soaring cathedrals, land she had never seen, where the air smelled of pine resin and smoke from blacksmiths hammering swords. Placed under the guardianship of Archbishop Bruno of Trier, she learned the guttural cadences of the German tongue, the intricacies of imperial court ritual, and the solemn weight of Latin prayers. Lessons in statecraft mingled with embroidery, the soft scrape of her needle through silk interrupted by tutors drilling her in imperial etiquette. Beneath it all lingered a silent dread. What child, after all, could grasp what it meant to become a wife to a stranger, much less an emperor? Even in the chapel, where she whispered prayers before stone saints, the thought crept in unbidden: what would be expected of her in the bedchamber, with no privacy, only witnesses hidden behind curtains to confirm that the union had been proven? On January 7, 1114, Matilda's childhood ended. In the Grand Cathedral of Mainz, beneath soaring arches heavy with incense, she walked the aisle. Her gown of crimson velvet shimmered with gold thread that bit into her skin, her veil a fragile barrier between her frightened eyes and the scrutiny of nobles drawn from every corner of the empire. At the altar, Henry V took her hand with the firm grip of a man accustomed to command, not affection. He bore the scars of battle across his stern face, marks of campaigns fought in mud and steel. The vows, spoken in solemn Latin, were words she understood but could not fully comprehend, their meaning too vast for her 12-year-old mind. The bells tolled over the Rhine Valley as the couple processed to the imperial palace. Feasts of roasted boar, rivers of spiced wine, troubadour songs, all of it a mask for the unease beneath. That night, in a chamber adorned with tapestries of conquest, servants stripped the bed to prepare it for the most intrusive ritual of all, the bedding ceremony. We can only imagine Matilda's terror. The chroniclers were silent on her tears, her protests, her whispered prayers. Such things had no place in the chronicles of kings. But we know the truth: she was a girl of 12, handed to a man of 28. A body unready, a spirit unformed, pressed into service for dynastic ambition. To the empire, consummation meant alliance secured. To Matilda, it meant the abrupt erasure of childhood. And yet, history moved forward. For 11 years, she was Empress of the Holy Roman Empire, traveling across German lands, learning to command respect, carrying herself with dignity even as her womb remained empty. When Henry V died in Utrecht on May 23, 1125, plagued, some say, by illness worsened by ceaseless campaigning, Matilda was only 23. A widow, childless, and alone. She returned to her father's court in Normandy bearing the hollow but heavy title of Empress. Some at court whispered of curses, pointing to her barrenness. Others dismissed her as a failure, her marriage fruitless, her youth wasted. Yet those whispers would not silence her. Instead, they hardened her resolve. For in those long, silent nights in imperial palaces, amid rustling silks and cold stone, Matilda learned a lesson that no chronicler dared write, that queens were pawns only until they chose to be players. Her story, beginning in fear, would later explode into one of the most turbulent struggles for the English throne. But for now, in the quiet dread of a wedding night, she stood as one of countless medieval brides whose lives were shaped not by love, but by power. Across the Channel, where the sun burned hotter and the air carried the mingled scents of lavender fields and the salt of the Atlantic, another young girl prepared for a fate not unlike Matilda's. Her name would one day echo across Europe as a figure of immense power, Eleanor of Aquitaine, but at 15 she was simply a daughter, an heiress, and above all, a prize. Eleanor was born around 1122 in the ducal court of Poitiers, into one of the wealthiest and most cultured regions of Europe. Aquitaine stretched from the Pyrenees to the Loire Valley, a land of vineyards heavy with grapes, troubadours singing under vaulted halls, and castles alive with poetry and hunting. It was a duchy so rich that kings envied it, so vast that its ruler wielded power almost equal to France's own monarch. When Eleanor's father, Duke William X, died suddenly in 1137, the 15-year-old girl became sole heiress to this sprawling territory. Overnight, she was transformed from a girl into a duchess, and with her inheritance came peril. She was not only wealthy but vulnerable. Every rival nobleman, every ambitious prince, would see her hand in marriage as the key to dominion over Aquitaine. Her father, sensing this before his death, had already made arrangements to protect her legacy. Her hand was promised to the son of the French king, the future Louis VII. Thus, the fate of Aquitaine was bound to the Capetian crown. The marriage was hastily arranged. On July 25, 1137, in the Cathedral of Saint-André in Bordeaux, the wedding was held beneath soaring stone vaults. Summer heat clung to the air, mixing with the scent of beeswax candles and fresh rushes strewn across the floor. Eleanor, radiant in a gown of sapphire blue silk embroidered with golden lions, walked down the aisle before a congregation of French and Aquitanian lords. The clash of cultures was evident even in the pews. French knights stiff in their armor, Aquitanian lords flamboyant in velvet and gold, troubadours whispering verses under their breath. Her bridegroom Louis was only 17. Pale-faced, raised in a monastery, he bore more the bearing of a monk than a monarch. He was pious, ascetic, and visibly uncomfortable in the courtly spectacle. His hands trembled as he placed the wedding ring on Eleanor's finger, and his eyes lowered, as though he could scarcely bring himself to meet her confident gaze. The feast that followed was as lavish as any in Christendom. Roasted peacocks with their feathers reattached for display, sweetmeats shaped like castles, goblets of spiced hippocras raised in toasts to fertility. Troubadour songs floated through the smoky air. Yet for Eleanor the festivities were hollow. The true weight of her fate loomed in the chamber that awaited them. As dusk settled over the Garonne River, attendants led the young couple to their bedchamber. The bedding ceremony was a ritual as old as feudal law. Priests murmured blessings over the mattress. Courtiers offered knowing glances and bawdy jokes, toasting the young couple's fertility. When the chamber doors closed, Eleanor's heart quickened. Beneath her chemise, linen clung to her skin in the humid air. Louis approached her hesitantly, his body stiff, his movements awkward, a boy trapped between religious scruples and royal duty. Chronicles would later hint at his reluctance. His monastic upbringing had instilled in him the belief that pleasure itself was sin, a temptation of the flesh. To consummate the marriage was his duty, not his desire, and Eleanor, spirited, worldly beyond her years, must have felt the sharp contrast between expectation and reality. For medieval queens, the wedding night was not private. Its success or failure would ripple through courts and kingdoms. If no sons were born, annulment or disgrace awaited. Eleanor must have known, even in that first uneasy night, that her worth would be measured not by her laughter, her wit, or even her immense lands, but by the children she produced. The years that followed confirmed her fears. Eleanor and Louis's union produced only daughters, Marie in 1145 and Alex in 1150. The lack of a male heir gnawed at their marriage, amplifying the differences between them. Eleanor was lively, passionate, drawn to poetry, falconry, and the bold life of her duchy. Louis was pious, austere, and given to fasting and long prayers. Their temperaments clashed like flint and steel. When the Second Crusade was called in 1147, Eleanor accompanied Louis to the Holy Land. In Antioch, Amid the exotic scents of spices and the shimmering silk markets, whispers swirled of her closeness to her uncle, Raymond of Poitiers. Whether gossip or truth, the rumors spread like wildfire, deepening the rift between husband and wife. By 1152 their marriage had unraveled. At Beaugency, near Orleans, their union was annulled, officially on the grounds of consanguinity, that convenient excuse so often wielded by the Church. In truth, it was incompatibility, frustration, and the absence of sons that dissolved their bond. And yet, in her very release, Eleanor revealed her strength. Within weeks, she remarried, this time to Henry Plantagenet, soon to be Henry II of England. Together they would forge the Angevin Empire, stretching from Scotland to the Pyrenees, a realm larger than that of the French king himself. She would give birth to 8 children, including 2 future kings, Richard the Lionheart and John. But on that first wedding night in Bordeaux, Eleanor of Aquitaine was only a girl standing at the threshold of a stranger's bed. Her heart fluttered with fear, her mind burdened with the unspoken truth that her body was no longer her own. In the years to come, she would become one of the most formidable queens in European history. Yet even for her, independence began in vulnerability, with the soft rustle of silk sheets and the heavy silence of expectation. Far to the north, where sea winds salted the air and looms clattered in busy workshops, another girl grew into womanhood beneath the watchful eyes of merchants and priests. This was Flanders, a land of wool and trade, where ships bobbed at harbor docks and markets overflowed with brightly dyed cloth. Here, around 1031, Count Baldwin V and Adela of France welcomed a daughter, Matilda. Unlike Eleanor's Aquitaine or Matilda of England's royal halls, the Flemish court thrummed with commerce. Diplomats from distant kingdoms rubbed shoulders with traders. The scent of sea salt mingled with fresh-dyed wool. Matilda grew up in an atmosphere where wealth flowed not just from land, but from the hands of artisans and merchants. Yet, as with every noble daughter, her fate was to be bargained, her body a cornerstone in Europe's shifting alliances. By her late teens she caught the eye of William, Duke of Normandy. William was no ordinary suitor. Born illegitimate, the son of Robert the Magnificent and his concubine Herleva, he had clawed his way to power with sheer determination and brutality. The bastard, they called him behind closed doors. But William had ambitions that burned hotter than insult. To secure his fragile legitimacy, he needed a bride of impeccable lineage. Matilda of Flanders, granddaughter of the French king, was perfect. Legend, embroidered by later chroniclers, tells us that when William first proposed, Matilda scorned him. "I would never marry a bastard." What followed, the tale insists, was violence. William, furious, rode into Bruges, dragged her through the streets by her hair, and left her beaten in the mud until she relented. Whether this story is truth or Norman propaganda meant to paint William as a man who bent destiny by force, we cannot say. But it has clung to their tale for centuries like blood on silk. What we do know is that their union faced fierce opposition. The two were distant cousins, and the Church had strict rules against consanguinity. In 1049, Pope Leo IX at the Council of Reims forbade the match. To defy the papacy was no small thing. It meant risking excommunication, the severing of salvation itself. In an age where damnation was a living fear, to marry against the pope's will was to risk not only political ruin but eternal hellfire. Still, William pressed forward. Their betrothal went ahead in secret, and around 1051 they wed, likely in EU Normandy. Imagine the scene: a chapel overlooking the churning channel, priests murmuring hurried blessings under the shadow of Rome's disapproval. Matilda, 20 years old, stood cloaked in Flemish linen, her hands trembling as vows bound her to a man whose temper was as infamous as his ambition. That night, as the hearths burned low and the sea winds rattled the shutters, the bedding ceremony carried its own unease. To share William's bed was not just to face the rough hands of a warrior hardened by rebellion and bloodshed, but to lie beneath the heavy knowledge that Rome had cursed their union. Would their children be branded illegitimate? Would their dynasty be broken before it began? The fear must have been palpable, pressing upon Matilda's chest as she closed her eyes. For years, the Pope's prohibition lingered like a storm cloud. At court in Bruges, her ladies whispered anxiously. In Normandy, William's allies fretted. To appease the Church, the couple founded 2 great abbeys in Caen, the Abbey of Saint Etienne and the Abbey of La Trinite. Their soaring stone towers were not merely monuments of faith, they were bargaining chips, acts of penance meant to persuade Rome to relent. And relent it did. In 1059, Pope Nicholas II granted a dispensation, blessing the union at last. Matilda's womb silenced all doubters. She bore between 9 and 10 children. sons who would ride into battle, daughters who would marry into the highest courts of Europe. William Rufus, Henry Beauclerk, and Robert Curthose, names that would echo in English chronicles for generations. Her fertility, her strength, her resilience, these made her not just Duchess of Normandy, but the bedrock of William's ambitions. When William crossed the Channel in 1066 to seize the crown of England, Matilda remained behind in Normandy. But she was no passive figure. She governed in his absence, her seal stamped on charters, her authority recognized by dukes and bishops alike. Chroniclers noted her wisdom, her ability to command loyalty, her quiet strength. She was not just William's wife, she was his partner in rule. And yet, their marriage was not without strain. By 1079, a bitter quarrel erupted between them over their son Robert Curthose, whose rebellion tore at the family. William raged at Robert's defiance. Matilda, sympathetic to her son, intervened. The tension between mother and father, wife and husband, revealed cracks even in a union that had weathered the Pope's ban. In the end, Matilda's life closed not in triumph but in piety. In 1083 at Cannes she died after a long illness, confessing her sins to priests who perhaps heard echoes of her earliest fears. The fear of that first wedding night, the fear of Rome's curse, the fear of children lost to rebellion. William, hardened by conquest, was said to be grief-stricken. 4 years later, he followed her into the grave, leaving behind an empire born of their defiance. The tapestry of their marriage, woven of fear, faith, and ferocity, still hangs in history like the famous cloth of Bayeux. But behind every stitch of conquest lies the quiet truth, that even queens trembled on their wedding night, not from passion, but from the weight of powers greater than themselves, kings, popes, and the fragile line between heaven and hell. Paris in the late 13th century glittered with the grandeur of the Capetian dynasty. Cathedrals rose like mountains of stone, the Seine shimmered with barges, and the court of King Philip IV, called the Fair for his striking looks, was a place of glittering ceremony and cold calculation. Among his children was Isabella, born in 1295, the youngest daughter, a princess molded from diplomacy and expectation. Chroniclers would later call her the she-wolf of France, but in her youth she was praised for her beauty, intelligence, and charm. She grew up surrounded by the wealth of Paris, tutored in Latin and French poetry, her every step watched by priests and courtiers. Yet her future was never her own. From the moment she could walk, she was destined to be a bride, a jewel to be placed in a foreign crown. That crown was England's. In 1308, at the age of just 12, Isabella was sent across the Channel to marry King Edward II, sealing peace between France and England. The journey itself was a ceremonial parade. Her ships, adorned with painted sails, left Boulogne in winter seas, carrying her toward a kingdom she had never seen, a husband she had never met, and a future that would define her as both queen and traitor. The wedding took place in Boulogne Cathedral, a setting of cold stone lit by hundreds of flickering candles. Isabella, small and pale in a gown heavy with French embroidery, stood beside Edward II, a man 23 years old. He was tall, handsome, with striking features inherited from his father, Edward I, the Hammer of the Scots. The crowd expected a glittering union of two powerful realms. But from the very beginning, shadows fell across the marriage bed. Edward's heart, it seemed, was already taken, not by his young bride, but by his beloved favorite, Piers Gaveston. The chronicles do not veil the scandal. At the coronation feast in Westminster, Edward spent more time with Gaveston than with his new queen. He showered him with gifts, jewels, titles, and lands, treasures that should have secured Isabella's place. Most shocking of all, he gave Gaveston the honor of carrying the crown's most precious jewel, while Isabella was left humiliated before her French entourage. Whispers rippled through the hall. The king preferred his companion's embrace to his bride's bed. That first wedding night must have been one of the loneliest in royal memory. The great chamber at Westminster, its walls hung with tapestries of hunting scenes, its bed covered in silk sheets, became a place of dread rather than union. Isabella, only 12, lay beneath the weight of her crown and her husband's indifference. Edward entered the chamber, but his thoughts were elsewhere, perhaps with Gaveston, perhaps with the freedom of his youth. For medieval queens, the wedding night was the pivot on which their fortunes turned. To fail in consummation was to invite whispers of annulment, disgrace, even exile. Isabella, though still a child, would have known that her body was now England's hope. The expectation of heirs pressed down upon her like the crown itself. In time, she bore 4 children, including the future Edward III, but the marriage never warmed. Edward's devotion to Gaveston, and later to other favorites such as Hugh Despenser the Younger, left Isabella isolated. She was mocked at court, her French attendants dismissed, her dignity trampled. Chroniclers describe her as sore grieved and ill-treated, her youth wasted on a husband whose affections lay elsewhere. By the 1320s, her humiliation had turned to fury. When Hugh Despencer's greed and cruelty consumed the English court, Isabella took matters into her own hands. She allied with Roger Mortimer, a Marcher lord exiled for rebellion. Together they plotted, raising an army in France, crossing the Channel and invading England. The Queen had transformed into a conqueror. In 1326, Edward II was captured, deposed, and imprisoned. Within a year he was dead, murdered, most believe at Berkeley Castle under gruesome circumstances whispered about for centuries. Isabella, once the neglected child bride, now stood as regent of England, ruling in her son's name with Mortimer at her side. The chronicles call her she-wolf for her ruthlessness, but beneath the legend lies the truth of a woman forced by betrayal to seize the power denied her. Her first wedding night, shrouded in loneliness and rejection, had shown her clearly that queens were pawns. By the end of her life, Isabella had proven she could be a player instead. In the sun-baked courts of Spain, where Moorish palaces glittered with fountains and tiled mosaics, a princess was born who would one day sit upon England's throne. Catherine of Aragon, the youngest daughter of Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile, the Catholic monarchs, was born in 1485, the same year Henry Tudor seized England's crown at Bosworth. Fate, it seemed, had already begun to weave their destinies together. Catherine grew up in the Alhambra and later in the palaces of Castile, schooled in Latin, theology, music, and the delicate arts of queenship. She was pious, intelligent, and steadfast, the embodiment of her parents' ambition to extend Spanish influence across Europe. At the tender age of 3, she was betrothed to Arthur, Prince of Wales, eldest son of Henry VII of England. The match promised an alliance between two rising dynasties, Tudor and Trastamara, binding England's fragile crown to Spain's mighty empire. At 15, Catherine embarked on her journey across the sea. She arrived in England in 1501, her ships landing at Plymouth after perilous storms. Dressed in Spanish silks, her hair braided in the Castilian style, she cut a striking figure. Chroniclers describe her as graceful, fair-skinned, with auburn hair that glinted like copper in the English sun. All England turned out to greet her, eager for a glimpse of the Spanish bride. Her wedding to Prince Arthur took place at St. Paul's Cathedral in November 1501. Imagine the spectacle, the great nave draped in crimson and gold, incense curling upward to the vaulted ceiling, 1,000 candles blazing in celebration. Catherine, just 16, stood before the altar while choirs sang in Latin. Arthur, tall and pale, pledged his vows. It was a marriage of dynasties, sealed with ceremony and expectation. But behind the pageantry lay fear. For medieval queens, the wedding night was the crucible of truth. The union had to be consummated, for without consummation the marriage could be annulled and alliances undone. That night, in the chilly bedchamber at Ludlow Castle, Catherine lay beside Arthur, a boy of 15, frail and sickly. What passed between them has been debated for centuries. Arthur boasted the next morning that he had been in the midst of Spain, a crude jest about betting his new wife. Yet his health soon faltered, and within months he was dead, taken by sweating sickness in 1502. Catherine, widowed before she was 17, was left stranded in a foreign land, her future uncertain. Worse still, her dowry, half paid by Spain, became a matter of bitter dispute. To resolve the crisis, Henry VII proposed that Catherine should marry Arthur's younger brother, Henry, the new heir to the throne. But here arose a grave obstacle. Canon law forbade a man to marry his brother's widow. To proceed, they would need papal dispensation. Catherine swore under oath that her marriage to Arthur had never been consummated, that she came to Henry's bed untouched. Whether this was truth or political necessity, only she knew. Pope Julius II granted the dispensation, and in 1509, Catherine wed Henry VIII, now King of England. The wedding was joyful, their coronation magnificent. Unlike her first marriage, there was no doubt about consummation here. Henry, vigorous and headstrong, boasted of his bride, and Catherine bore him children. Yet tragedy followed. Of her 6 pregnancies, only 1 child survived infancy. Mary, born in 1516. As the years passed, Catherine's failure to produce a male heir gnawed at Henry's pride and patience. He who had once adored her began to look elsewhere, first to mistresses, then to Anne Boleyn. What began as a royal love match soured into a bitter struggle that would shake Christendom. In the end, Catherine's steadfast claim, that she had never consummated her marriage with Arthur, became the linchpin of England's break with Rome. Henry, desperate to annul their union, and Mary Anne argued the opposite, that Catherine had indeed lain with Arthur, making their marriage invalid in God's eyes. The Pope refused to yield. Henry, enraged, severed England from the Catholic Church, making himself head of the Church of England. Thus, the fate of England's faith, crown, and people turned upon that single night at Ludlow Castle, the wedding night of Arthur and Catherine. Did the frail boy prince truly consummate his marriage? Or was Catherine's lifelong testimony the truth? History cannot answer. But the consequences of that night echo still, a reminder of how the private fears of a teenage bride became the fault line of nations. In December 1542 at Linlithgow Palace, a child was born whose life would unfold like a tragedy written by fate itself. Mary Stuart, daughter of James V of Scotland and Mary of Guise, entered the world just as her father lay dying. At 6 days old, she was crowned Queen of Scots, an infant with a crown too heavy for her cradle. Scotland was a kingdom in turmoil, divided between pro-English and pro-French factions, Protestant reformers and Catholic loyalists. To secure her throne, Mary's guardians turned to France, that old ally of Scotland in the Auld Alliance. At 5 years old, the little queen was betrothed to the Dauphin of France, François, heir to Henry II. At age 6, she was sent across the sea to grow up in the glittering French court. There she blossomed. Tall for a woman, with auburn hair, hazel eyes, and a grace inherited from generations of royalty, Mary was praised as one of the most beautiful princesses of Europe. She was witty, educated in Latin, Greek, Italian, and French, and gifted in music and poetry. The French adored her. She was the jewel of their court, destined to be a queen not only of Scotland but of France as well. In 1558, at 16, Mary married François in the Grand Cathedral of Notre Dame. The wedding was a magnificent spectacle, with Paris streets filled with cheering crowds, banners fluttering in the spring air. Mary, in white and gold, looked every inch a queen, while François, delicate and sickly, leaned on her for strength. That night, in the silken bedchambers of the Louvre, their marriage was consummated, or so the court proclaimed. But François was frail, perhaps incapable of passion, and Mary's first union was brief. Within 2 years, François was dead, his health wasted by illness. At 18, Mary was a widow, childless, and vulnerable. France was no longer her home. She returned to Scotland, a land she had not seen since childhood, to rule as queen in her own right. It was then that her second marriage was arranged, this time not for alliances abroad, but to secure her rule at home. In 1565, she wed Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley, a tall, handsome cousin with Tudor blood that gave him a claim to the English throne. Their match was one of passion at first. Mary, 22, was enamored of his beauty and charm. But the wedding night revealed another truth. Darnley, though vigorous, was arrogant, jealous, and vain. He resented Mary's authority, demanding the crown matrimonial to rule beside her. His temper and ambition soured the marriage. Though she bore him a son, James, the future king who would unite Scotland and England, the bond between Mary and Darnley disintegrated into hatred. In February 1567, their marriage ended in murder. Darnley was found strangled after a house in Kirklefield exploded. Whispers pointed to Mary's third great passion, James Hepburn, Earl of Bothwell. Within months, scandal erupted as Mary wed Bothwell in a hasty Protestant ceremony. The union shocked Scotland. Many believed Bothwell had engineered Darnley's death to claim Mary as his own. Whether she loved him, feared him, or was forced into the match remains a question historians still debate. Their wedding night, cloaked in suspicion, was less a union of love than a seal upon scandal. This final marriage destroyed her. Nobles rose in rebellion, denouncing Bothwell as a murderer and Mary as complicit. At Carberry Hill, she surrendered. Bothwell fled into exile. Mary was imprisoned. Soon she was forced to abdicate in favor of her infant son, James VI. Her flight into England in 1568 sealed her doom. Instead of finding refuge, she became Elizabeth I's prisoner for 19 years, until the axe fell at Fotheringhay in 1587. Mary's beauty and charm had made her the darling of Europe, but her choices in marriage, each wedding night carrying with it the hopes of dynasties, had become the stepping stones of her downfall. The child bride of France, the passionate queen of Scotland, the scandalous consort of Bothwell. Each role led her closer to the block. In her final moments, robed in crimson for martyrdom, Mary prayed aloud, "Still the queen, still the bride of fate." Vienna in the mid-18th century was the beating heart of the Habsburg Empire, a city of music, marble halls, and imperial ambition. In 1755, Archduchess Maria Antonia was born to Empress Maria Theresa, ruler of Austria, Hungary, and Bohemia. The girl who would later be known to history as Marie Antoinette was the 15th of 16 children, a pawn in the Empress's vast game of dynastic diplomacy. From childhood, Maria Antonia was destined for marriage abroad. She was trained in dance, music, and etiquette, though she was a frivolous student, more inclined to laughter and play than scholarship. At 14, she was chosen to wed the Dauphin of France, Louis Auguste, grandson of Louis XV. The marriage would bind Austria and France, once bitter enemies, into an alliance against Prussia and Britain. Her departure from Vienna in 1770 was marked by ritual. At the border between Austria and France, she underwent the handover ceremony, stripped of her Austrian clothes and dressed anew in French finery, symbolically reborn as a daughter of France. From that moment on, she was no longer Maria Antonia, but Marie Antoinette. The wedding took place in Versailles, a festival of gold and glitter. Tens of thousands thronged the gardens, fireworks lit the night sky. Marie, only 14, was married to Louis, a shy and awkward boy of 15. The two adolescents, scarcely more than children, were thrust into the most magnificent court in Europe, expected to embody not only love, but the survival of empires. But when the celebrations faded, the real test began, the wedding night. Tradition demanded that the marriage be consummated immediately. The royal couple were escorted to their bedchamber by courtiers and family, who blessed the sheets and prayed for fertility. Marie lay in silks, her hair piled high with jewels, her face painted for the ceremony. Louis, timid and uneasy, joined her. Then, nothing. For weeks, then months, their marriage remained unconsummated. Louis was painfully shy, uncertain of himself, and perhaps suffering from a mild physical impediment, phimosis, some doctors suggested, that made intimacy difficult. Marie, bewildered and humiliated, wrote to her mother in Austria of her loneliness. The empress, stern and pragmatic, scolded her. "A queen must do her duty. You must win your husband." Years passed. Versailles buzzed with gossip. The Dauphin and Dauphine shared a bed but not a union. Courtiers whispered of impotence, barrenness, or indifference. Caricatures mocked them. France demanded an heir, but the cradle remained empty. Finally, in 1777, 7 years after their wedding, their marriage was consummated. The cause remains debated. Perhaps Louis overcame his shyness, perhaps surgery relieved his condition, perhaps time itself dissolved the barriers. Whatever the reason, at last Marie conceived, and in 1778 she bore her first child, Marie-Thérèse. Yet the delay had already planted seeds of distrust. Pamphlets mocked her as Madame Deficit, blaming her for extravagance, frivolity, and childlessness. The shadow of those early years never left her. Even as she bore 4 children, including the ill-fated Dauphin Louis Charles, the image of a frivolous, barren queen clung to her. When the revolution erupted in 1789, those whispers hardened into accusations. Marie Antoinette was painted as a foreign parasite, indifferent to her people's suffering. The infamous, though apocryphal, phrase, "let them eat cake," became her epitaph in rumor. And so the wedding night that failed to unite 2 teenagers became, in hindsight, a symbol of everything the French people despised. Weakness in their king, extravagance in their queen, and a monarchy incapable of fulfilling even its most basic duty. In 1793, as the guillotine blade fell in the Place de la Révolution, Marie Antoinette, still elegant in her torn white chemise, met her fate with courage. But her story had begun long before, with a marriage bed left cold and a duty unmet. In the windswept province of Pomerania, in 1729, a girl was born who would one day rule Russia with iron and brilliance. Her name at birth was Sophie Friedrich Auguste of Anhalt-Zerbst, a minor German princess of modest means but sharp ambition. She was clever, fluent in French, quick-witted, and determined to rise above the obscurity of her tiny principality. Her chance came when Empress Elizabeth of Russia, daughter of Peter the Great, sought a bride for her nephew and heir, the Grand Duke Peter. Sophie was chosen for her lineage, her beauty, and her pliability. At 14, she was summoned to St. Petersburg, baptized into the Orthodox faith, and given a new name, Ekaterina Alexeyevna, Catherine. Her groom, however, was no glittering prince. Grand Duke Peter was awkward, childish, and obsessed with toy soldiers. He despised Russia, idolized Prussia, and treated Catherine with disdain. At 16, Catherine found herself bound to a boy who preferred playing war games in his chambers to sharing a bed with his bride. Their wedding in 1745 was splendid, gold-domed churches, choirs of priests chanting, courtiers bowing in jewels and furs. Catherine, radiant in brocade and pearls, was presented as the future mother of Tsars. Yet when the ceremony ended and the night began, the illusion crumbled. The wedding night passed without consummation. And the next night. And the next. For years, Peter neglected her, more interested in his pets, his soldiers, and his bottles than his wife. Rumors spread that he was impotent, or too immature to understand his duty. Catherine, humiliated and isolated, kept her silence, but in her private writings she later confessed her despair. She was expected to produce heirs, yet she could not even secure her husband's attention. For 8 long years their marriage remained unfulfilled. Empress Elizabeth, furious at the lack of grandchildren, berated Catherine and threatened her security. Catherine, resourceful and patient, turned to charm, wit, and politics, cultivating allies at court. She read secretly Voltaire, Montesquieu, the Enlightenment philosophers, arming her mind while her husband squandered his future. Eventually, Catherine took lovers, men who not only offered her affection but also secured her political survival. In 1754 she bore her first child, Paul. Officially he was the son of Peter, but whispers in the corridors of power suggested otherwise. Still, the Empress was delighted and Catherine's position was secured. When Empress Elizabeth died in 1762, Peter ascended the throne as Peter III of Russia. But his reign lasted only months. He alienated the Orthodox Church, enraged the army, and threatened to divorce Catherine. At last, the woman long scorned as a neglected bride seized her chance. That summer, Catherine orchestrated a coup. With the backing of the Imperial Guard and the Church, she deposed her husband and declared herself Catherine II, Empress of Russia. Days later, Peter was dead, murdered under mysterious circumstances. Catherine, the foreign bride once ignored on her wedding night, now ruled the greatest empire on earth. For 34 years she reigned as Catherine the Great, expanding Russia's borders, modernizing its institutions, and patronizing the arts and philosophy of the Enlightenment. She became one of the most formidable monarchs in history. Yet it all began with a failed marriage and a wedding night left empty. Catherine's brilliance was forged in loneliness and neglect, her ambition sharpened by the humiliation of being bound to a man unworthy of her. What should have been a union of dynasties became instead the spark for revolution. From abandoned bride to empress, hers was perhaps the most extraordinary transformation of them all.